You know, when we think about tragedies, we often picture things that happen suddenly out of nowhere. But the truth is, most disasters don't come out of the blue. They build, slowly, silently, layer by layer, warning after warning until it's too late. This is the story of one of those disasters. I'm talking about the Challenger the Space Shuttle that exploded just 73 seconds after liftoff, right in front of a live audience that included millions of schoolchildren across America. It was supposed to be a moment of inspiration, a symbol of hope. Instead, it became a national heartbreak, and for many, a lifelong memory they'd rather forget. But behind the smoke and wreckage was something deeper, something darker. This isn't just the story of a tragic accident. It's a story about missed warnings, silenced voices, and the price we pay when appearance becomes more important than accountability. I'm glad you're here because this one matters. And once you hear the full story, I think you'll understand why. Chapter 1. The Day. Everything changed. I still remember the way the light hit the classroom windows that morning. January 28th, 1986. I was just a kid sitting in school like any other day, except this one felt a little different. Our teacher rolled in one of those clunky TV carts, you know, the kind with the straps and the buzzing screen, and told us we were about to witness history. Krista McAuliffe, a school teacher just like ours, was going to space. That was the headline. A teacher was going to teach a class from outer space live. It felt exciting, surreal even, like maybe this was the future. Maybe one day we'd be up there too. We were all so proud, so hopeful, so ready. The clock hit 11:38 a.m. We were glued to the screen, wide-eyed and restless in our little plastic chairs. The shuttle Challenger lifted off, soaring into that perfect Florida sky. The countdown, the engines roaring, it was like watching a dream take flight. There were cheers, laughter, even a few claps in the room, and then, 73 seconds later, it happened. There was a strange flash, a forked plume of smoke, confusion, silence. No one understood what they were seeing, not the teachers, not us, not the millions of people across the country who had tuned in, hoping to feel inspired, maybe even proud. It was only later that we learned what we had actually witnessed: the deaths of all 7 crew members on board. You know, it's wild how a single moment can split a country in two. Before the Challenger space travel felt like progress. After it, it felt like grief, like betrayal. I didn't fully understand it then. I mean, how could I? But that day stayed with me. And the older I got, the more I wondered, what really happened? How does something so public, so celebrated, go so catastrophically wrong right in front of everyone? This story isn't just about a shuttle explosion. It's about politics, pride, power, and the quiet warnings that were ignored. It's about the people behind the scenes, the ones who tried to speak up and were told to sit down. It's about how history, especially the darkest parts, is almost never an accident. And so today I want to revisit that day. Not just the tragedy, but everything that led up to it. Because the Challenger didn't just fall from the sky, it was pushed. Chapter 2. A Race to the Stars. A War on the Ground. You know, when you grow up hearing about space, it sounds like this magical, untouchable thing. Rockets, planets, possibility. As kids, we were taught to look up, always up. But behind that glossy image of space exploration, behind the shiny silver suits and zero-gravity tricks, was something darker. Something a little more human. NASA wasn't just born out of curiosity. It was born out of fear. Cold War fear. And maybe that's where all of this really begins. See, after World War II ended, the world didn't get peace, not really. It just shifted into something quieter, more psychological. The Cold War wasn't about bombs dropping or tanks rolling across borders. It was about who could outdo who could dominate not with firepower, but with ideas, innovation, and image. By the 1950s, the Soviet Union was flexing its muscles in space. First satellite in orbit, first man in space. They were winning. And America was watching, silently panicking. So in response, the US pulled together some of the brightest minds they could find. And I mean literally pulled them. Many of them were former Nazi scientists, brought over through a top-secret project called Operation Paperclip. That part rarely makes it into the textbooks, but it happened. We made deals. We looked the other way, because winning the space race mattered more than moral clean hands. NASA was built on a foundation of competition. This wasn't just about reaching for the stars, it was about proving we were the best. And that kind of pressure. It doesn't just drive innovation, it also makes people cut corners. It breeds silence. In the 1960s, that pressure worked in our favor. We landed on the moon, July 20th, 1969. I wasn't alive yet, but even today, when you hear those words, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, you feel something. It was like the whole country exhaled like we had finally won, finally. But the thing is, once you've won the biggest race in human history, what's left? By the time the 70s rolled around, public interest in space was fading fast. People weren't tuning in to watch rocket launches anymore. There were no more moon landings to cheer for. And Congress, they were starting to question the budget. Space was expensive, and to many Americans it had started to feel unnecessary. That scared NASA. Because without public support, there's no funding. Without funding, there's no future. And so slowly but surely, they started shifting focus from big, bold moonshots to reusable shuttles, PR campaigns, and symbolic missions that could win hearts again. They didn't just want to keep flying. They needed the country to care. And that's how the stage was set for one of the most well-intentioned, carefully packaged, and ultimately devastating missions in space history. The Challenger wasn't just about science, it was about saving NASA's image. And when the mission becomes more about perception than safety, you can feel it, something's going to break. Chapter 3: A Shuttle, a Symbol, a Teacher. After the moon landing, NASA had to evolve or risk becoming irrelevant. That's when the idea of the space shuttle came into focus. Unlike the towering one-time use rockets of the past, these shuttles were designed to be reusable. More efficient, more cost-effective, at least that was the dream. In 1981, the first shuttle, Columbia, launched into orbit. It was a big deal. And over the next few years, NASA rolled out more Discovery, Atlantis, Endeavour, and of course, Challenger. They weren't just spaceships, they were symbols, flying testaments to progress, to American ingenuity. But as much as NASA wanted these launches to feel routine, space travel is never truly routine. It's a delicate balance of science, engineering, luck, and pressure. By 1984, NASA was feeling the heat again. People weren't watching like they used to. The awe was fading. So someone had the idea, what if we sent a regular person into space, not an astronaut, not a military pilot, just someone normal, someone like us. And that's how the Teacher in Space project was born. I want you to imagine this. You're a teacher. You spend your days grading papers, managing teenagers, trying to explain history to a room full of kids who'd rather be anywhere else. Then one day, you're told you could be selected to travel into orbit, to teach from space. Over 11,000 teachers applied. Think about that for a second. 11,000 people who said yes to the unimaginable. After a rigorous selection process, it came down to one woman, Krista McAuliffe. She was 36 years old, a high school social studies teacher from New Hampshire. She had 2 kids, a husband, a quiet, grounded life. And when she got the call, she didn't just accept it, she embraced it. I've watched interviews of her from that time. And what struck me most wasn't how brave she seemed, though she was. It was how normal she was. She smiled like someone who didn't fully realize the weight of the role she'd just taken on. Because Krista wasn't just going to space. She was becoming the face of the mission. She would give lessons from orbit, talk to kids across America, remind the country that education mattered, that science was still exciting. NASA had found their perfect spokesperson, a mother, a teacher, a dreamer, but I don't think they ever really planned for what would happen if something went wrong. Because how could they? When you place hope in a person, when you tie your future to their story, you never think about what it might look like if the story ends too soon. And Krista, she was just getting started. Chapter 4: Warnings in the Cold. The thing about tragedy is, it rarely happens without warning. Most of the time, it's not some lightning bolt from the sky. It's a slow build, a quiet accumulation of red flags that people choose not to see or worse, deliberately ignore. And the Challenger mission. It had plenty of warnings. At first, the launch was scheduled for July 1985, but like many space missions, it got delayed, pushed to November, then December, and eventually January of 1986. The closer it got, the more complicated everything seemed to become: technical issues, scheduling conflicts, even the weather. But despite all that, Krista and the crew kept showing up. They trained, they smiled, they posed for photos. Because that's what you do when the whole country is watching. You keep showing up. The night before the final launch date, January 28th, temperatures in Florida dropped lower than they had in years. It was below freezing, something completely abnormal for Cape Canaveral. Engineers were concerned especially about the ice forming on the launch pad, and inside NASA people were talking. People knew this kind of cold could affect the shuttle. There were meetings, phone calls, reports, and one issue kept coming up over and over again: the O-rings. Now, I didn't know what an O-ring was either, not until I started digging into this. It's just a little rubber seal, really. A circular gasket that's supposed to keep fuel and pressure contained within the rocket boosters. It's a small part, insignificant looking, but its job absolutely vital. And in cold temperatures, O-rings can stiffen. They don't flex the way they're supposed to. They don't seal as tightly, which means leaks. Engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company that helped manufacture the solid rocket boosters, begged NASA to delay the launch. They said it clearly multiple times: the O-rings might fail in that kind of cold. And if they did, it could mean catastrophe. But those warnings didn't go very far. See, when a mission is tied to politics, to publicity, to live television broadcasts and presidential speeches, delays become inconvenient, and inconvenient truths get brushed aside. From what I've read, there was this overwhelming pressure to just go through with it, to stay on schedule. The media was there, the president was watching. Schools across America had their TVs set up ready to watch history unfold. And Krista, she was ready too. In the crew's final hours, they ate breakfast together. They suited up. They walked out waving, smiling, full of that quiet courage that people only really show when they believe in what they're doing. But underneath all of that, beneath the ceremony, the tradition, the pride, was this gnawing truth: people had spoken up and they were ignored. And looking back now, knowing what we know, it almost feels like the countdown had already started, not to liftoff, but to disaster. Chapter 5. 73 seconds, January 28th, 1986. The morning was cold, unusually cold for Florida. The sky was a clear, icy blue, almost too perfect, and for a moment it looked like maybe everything was finally going to go according to plan. The crew woke up early. They had their usual pre-launch breakfast. There's a photo from that morning: 7 astronauts sitting around a table, dressed in flight suits, smiling like they're just having a regular day. But it wasn't a regular day. It never was. Krista McAuliffe was there, bright-eyed, nervous, hopeful. This wasn't just a science mission. It was a message to the country, to the world, that education matters, that teachers matter. That space was for everyone, not just for men in uniforms, but for mothers and students and dreamers. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown hit 0. Challenger lifted off the pad in a plume of fire and smoke slicing through the sky. On the ground, people clapped. In classrooms across America, kids cheered. Teachers stood with their hands over their hearts. For many of them, this was the first time they'd ever seen someone like Krista do something so unimaginable. It was electric. It was hopeful. I've watched that footage dozens of times, and every time I find myself holding my breath. Because 73 seconds later, it happened. A flash. A bloom of smoke. And then nothing. At first, no one understood what they were seeing. Some people thought it was part of the mission, some new stage of the launch. But it wasn't. The Challenger had broken apart in midair. The shuttle didn't explode in the traditional sense. It disintegrated under the pressure of failure. 7 lives were lost, instantly. Or so we were told. I can't imagine what it felt like to be in that mission control room. You go from celebration to horror in a matter of seconds. You watch something you helped build, something you believed in, fall from the sky. And worse, you know that people were inside. Millions of kids watched it live, including me. That moment burned into our collective memory didn't just shatter a shuttle. It shattered a generation's belief that space was safe, that dreams were bulletproof, that if we worked hard enough and followed the rules, everything would work out. And it was heartbreaking. The days that followed were filled with silence, confusion, mourning. I remember the news anchors struggling for words, the way teachers tried to explain it without really understanding it themselves. How do you explain to a child that the people we looked up to literally had just died in front of us? Krista wasn't coming back. None of them were. And as the smoke cleared, the question that began to rise slowly, painfully, was, how could this happen? Because this wasn't just a tragic accident. It was something worse, something far more difficult to accept. It was preventable. Chapter 6. The Silence That Followed. In the hours after the explosion, everything felt still. It was that kind of silence that only comes after something truly awful. Like the world was holding its breath, waiting for someone to say it wasn't real. But it was. News stations scrambled. Some tried to maintain composure, others just couldn't. Teachers across the country turned off their classroom TVs and stood there, stunned, not knowing what to tell their students. And I think a lot of us, kids, parents, adults, were asking the same question: did they suffer? It's a brutal question, but it's the human one. We were told early on that the crew likely died instantly, that the explosion was too fast, too powerful, too complete. And maybe, at the time, that was a kindness, something to help soften the edges of the horror. But the truth would turn out to be much harder to swallow. Months later, when investigations got underway, we learned that some of the crew had likely survived the initial breakup of the shuttle, that 3 of their emergency oxygen packs had been manually activated, meaning someone, maybe multiple people, were conscious after the explosion. Alive. Aware. They knew. And that's a thought I've never been able to shake. The crew cabin, the part they were in, separated from the shuttle and plummeted into the Atlantic Ocean, hitting the surface at over 200 miles per hour. There was no chance of survival, but that window of time, those seconds between hope and impact, it haunts me. Because now we're not just talking about a technical failure. We're talking about human lives, trapped in a system that failed them twice. First in the air, then on the ground. And the more investigators looked, the more it became clear this didn't have to happen. That's what hit the hardest. This wasn't an unpredictable tragedy. It was a chain of decisions. A series of warnings, ignored red flags, buried pressure prioritized over safety. NASA had known for years that there were issues with the shuttle's O-rings, those little rubber seals we talked about earlier. They knew. But the launches kept happening, and the excuses kept coming. And this time, it caught up to them. You know, I always believed NASA was this unshakable symbol of precision, of science, of integrity. But the Challenger disaster showed us something else, that even the most trusted institutions can bend under pressure. That ambition, when mixed with politics and image, can become dangerous. And while the country mourned those 7 lives behind closed doors, people were already scrambling to protect themselves. Reputations were on the line, contracts, careers. The truth was coming, and they knew it. So the question shifted from what happened to why did no one stop it? And that's where things start to get really dark. Chapter 7. The Warnings They Buried. By the time the Rogers Commission was formed to investigate the Challenger disaster, the public was already searching for someone to blame. And honestly, so was I. Because once the shock faded and the grief settled, all that was left was this hollow question: how could this happen? And more importantly, who knew it could happen and did nothing? Turns out, quite a few people. Let's go back, years before the launch. As early as 1977, NASA and one of its key contractors, a company called Morton Thiokol, had already identified a problem with the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, specifically the O-rings, those small rubber seals that were supposed to prevent gas leaks during launch. In test after test, those rings were failing, sometimes just a little, sometimes significantly. The engineers saw it, they documented it, they raised the alarms, but the responses, they were disturbingly casual. One report even described the performance failures as acceptable. I remember reading that word and just sitting with it for a moment. Acceptable. As if a malfunction on a shuttle carrying human beings could ever be something you just accept. And that wasn't the only time it happened. In 1981, after one shuttle flight, the O-rings were visibly scorched, literally burned. Still, the flights continued. Then again in 1985, just a year before the Challenger launch, the damage was worse. Engineers started saying it more plainly: these rings are not safe. But here's the thing: warnings are only as powerful as the people willing to listen to them. And at Morton Thiokol, listening wasn't the priority, keeping the NASA contract was. NASA, for its part, had a budget to protect, a schedule to maintain, and a very public image to uphold. Scrubbing the launch would have meant bad press, delays, doubts. It would have looked like weakness. So they minimized, deflected, rationalized. And the deeper the commission dug, the uglier it got. Some engineers actually recommended grounding the fleet entirely until a permanent fix could be implemented. But that fix, it would take years. It would cost millions. So instead of addressing the problem, they buried it. They called it data inconclusive. They said things like, it hasn't failed catastrophically yet. That word, yet, it chills me. Because it wasn't a matter of if. It was always a matter of when. And then came the night before the launch. Engineers at Morton Thiokol begged their leadership not to approve the launch. They pointed directly to the O-rings, specifically how they were likely to stiffen in the cold temperatures. They even faxed over charts, graphs, data. It was all there. One engineer, Alan MacDonald, refused to sign the launch recommendation. He said, and this is a direct quote, "If anything happens to this launch, I wouldn't want to be the person that has to stand in front of the Board of Inquiry to explain why we launched." He knew, and still. The executives overruled the engineers, just like that. They gave NASA the green light. The next morning, Challenger was cleared for launch. In that moment, it wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a leadership failure. A chain of decisions built not on science or safety, but on ego pressure and political image. When I think about that, it doesn't just make me angry, it makes me sick. Because 7 people trusted the system, trusted the experts, trusted that if something was unsafe, they wouldn't be allowed to fly. But they were allowed, and they did. And now they're gone. Not because of a freak accident, but because the truth was inconvenient and someone decided to ignore it. Chapter 8. The Politics of a Launch. It's easy to think of space travel as something above politics, something pure, something rooted in science exploration, maybe even hope. But the Challenger launch. That wasn't just a mission, it was a performance. And behind the curtain, politics played a bigger role than anyone wanted to admit. At the time, President Ronald Reagan was preparing to deliver his annual State of the Union address, a nationally televised speech, watched by millions. It was scheduled for the evening of January 28, 1986, the same day Challenger was set to launch. That timing wasn't a coincidence, because in that speech, Reagan planned to highlight the Teacher in Space project, to talk about Christa McAuliffe as a symbol of American values, education, bravery, patriotism. It was supposed to be a beautiful moment, an image of progress, of unity, a teacher in space, and the president honoring her before the entire country. Except, it didn't go that way. And here's the part that still feels so wrong to me: the launch should have been delayed. Not just because of the cold weather, not just because of the O-ring concerns, but because actual engineers were raising hell behind the scenes, begging for time, begging for caution, but caution doesn't photograph well, and delays don't play well in prime time. So instead of waiting even just one more day, they pushed forward, because the cameras were rolling, because the president had a speech to give, because the story needed to fit the schedule. I keep thinking about that, how a tragedy this massive might have been avoided if it weren't for politics. And I'm not talking about political parties or policies. I'm talking about image, about the obsession with looking strong, decisive, victorious, especially during the Cold War when everything felt like a contest. NASA was under pressure to perform, to prove that America still led the charge in space exploration, that our technology, our scientists, our ideals, they were still unmatched, and sending a civilian, a teacher, into orbit, that was supposed to be a PR slam dunk. But instead of inspiring the nation, it devastated it. Reagan ended up postponing his State of the Union that night. Instead, he addressed the country from the Oval Office, speaking directly to the children who had watched the shuttle explode in real time. I've watched that speech more than once. It's calm, measured, presidential. But no speech could undo what had happened. Because what we saw that day wasn't just an accident, it was the cost of prioritizing perception over people. And I think that's what still lingers. The idea that this disaster wasn't just technical, it was strategic. That behind the smiling press releases and bold declarations, people in power made a calculation, and 7 lives were the price. Chapter 9. Unraveling the Truth. In the days following the Challenger disaster, grief swept across the country like a slow-moving fog. You could feel it everywhere in schools and workplaces, even in grocery stores. People weren't just mourning 7 lives. They were mourning the idea that somehow America had failed its own dream. And when something this public, this devastating happens, people want answers. So President Reagan announced the creation of a presidential commission to investigate the cause of the accident. It would be called the Rogers Commission, named after its chairman, William P. Rogers, a former Secretary of State. But the real headlines came from who else was on it. Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space. Scientists, engineers, astronauts. These were people who knew what spaceflight demanded and what it should never become. At first, I wanted to believe the commission would fix everything. That justice would be served, that someone would stand up and finally say, we failed these people. But it wasn't that simple. The deeper the commission dug, the more complicated and disturbing the picture became. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a culture of silence, a pattern of ignoring concerns, of pushing forward because stopping would have meant asking uncomfortable questions. Internal memos surfaced, memos from engineers who had repeatedly raised concerns about the O-rings, test results that showed deterioration, notes that warned of disaster under certain weather conditions. These weren't vague warnings, they were specific, documented, and sent years before the explosion. And then came the most damning discovery of all people. At both NASA and Morton Thiokol had known the launch was unsafe. Not just suspected, known. It was Alan McDonald, the Morton Thiokol engineer who refused to sign off on the launch, who later testified before Congress. His voice didn't tremble. He laid it all out, how engineers had recommended a delay, how their objections were overruled by management, and how the company gave NASA the green light anyway. Hearing that made my stomach turn. Because when people like McDonald tried to do the right thing, they were silenced, ignored, pushed aside in favor of deadlines and media optics, and yet somehow no one was criminally charged. Let that sink in. 7 people died in a disaster that multiple people saw coming, and still no one went to prison. There were no trials, no convictions, just bureaucracy, a quiet shuffling of blame. Morton Thiokol lost its contract briefly, but they were soon back in business. NASA restructured, made some technical upgrades, changed its reporting procedures, and over time the media moved on. The headlines faded, but the loss never did. Because here's what really hurts: the system didn't break. It worked exactly the way it was designed to protect power, to deflect responsibility, and to keep moving forward. And it makes you wonder, how many other warnings have we ignored? How many other tragedies started the same way? With a memo that no one wanted to read. Sometimes I think about the families, the parents, the kids, the students who looked up to Krista McAuliffe as more than a teacher, as a hero. I wonder what it felt like watching the hearings, watching the same government that promised to protect their loved ones now quietly burying the truth. The Challenger disaster wasn't just a moment of national tragedy, it was a mirror. And what it showed us was a system more concerned with appearances than accountability. Chapter 10. Echoes that never faded. Some tragedies come and go, we mourn, we move on, but the Challenger, it stuck. It embedded itself deep into our national memory, not just as a technical failure or a political scandal, but as something far more intimate. because so many of us watched it happen. It's hard to explain what that does to you, especially when you're young. You grow up believing in certain truths, that the grown-ups are in charge, that smart people make smart decisions, that someone somewhere is keeping you safe. And then you watch a shuttle break apart in the sky with a teacher on board, a mother, a symbol, and no one can tell you why, or at least not right away. After Challenger, NASA grounded all shuttle flights for almost 3 years. They redesigned parts of the shuttle, reworked safety protocols, restructured how concerns were reported and who had the authority to stop a launch. On paper, they did what they were supposed to do, but fixing hardware is one thing, fixing culture is another. It took a long time for the public to trust NASA again. There was a fracture, something that couldn't be repaired with a press conference or a new flight plan. And for a lot of people, space never quite felt the same after that. I've talked to teachers who were in classrooms that day, who still remember the silence after the explosion. I've talked to kids who became adults with a quiet fear of flying, or a deep distrust of institutions. Because Challenger didn't just fall from the sky, it shook our belief in how systems are supposed to work. And then there's Krista. I think about her a lot, about how she probably never imagined that her legacy would be tied to tragedy. She wanted to inspire kids, to teach from orbit, to prove that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, and in a way she did, just not in the way any of us wanted. Her memory and the memory of the 6 other crew members deserves more than just a statue or a name on a plaque. It deserves honesty and accountability, and the uncomfortable truth that their deaths could have been prevented if the people in charge had chosen courage over convenience. That's the thing about history. It doesn't just sit in the past. It echoes. It reminds us. It warns us. And the Challenger disaster. It still speaks. It says, don't wait for disaster to listen to the people who see it coming. It says, no dream is worth more than a life. And it reminds us that even in a system built for greatness, human choices are what determine the outcome. So when we look back at Challenger, not just as a moment, but as a lesson, we have to ask ourselves, have we really learned anything? Because the truth is, the next tragedy always starts the same way, with a warning no one wanted to hear. So, that's the story of the Challenger disaster, a story about ambition, pressure, silence, and the 7 lives that were lost because of it. But it's also a story about how systems fail. Not because they're broken, but because they're designed to protect power, not people. About how warning signs don't matter when no one's willing to look up from the launch schedule. And the thing is, this isn't just a story from 1986. This kind of thing still happens. In corporations, in governments, in places where decisions are made behind closed doors and where the loudest voices are the ones telling us everything's fine. Maybe that's why the Challenger still haunts us, not because it ended in an explosion, but because so many people saw it coming and no one was willing to stop it. Thank you for watching this episode of True Crime Echoes. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that stories like this need to be remembered, not just retold, consider subscribing for more stories that dig deep into the human cost of silence. Take care of yourselves. And as always, stay curious, stay aware, and never stop asking why.